Welcome to The Landscape, your show about America's parks and public lands. I'm Aaron Weiss with the Center for Western Priorities in Denver.
And I'm Kate Groetzinger in Salt Lake City. Today on the podcast, we're talking to a reporter with Floodlight News who looked into a land swap in the Crazy Mountains that cut off public access to a lot of good Forest Service land at the behest of the billionaire members of the Yellowstone Club, which includes Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, believe it or not. We're excited to share that with you, but first, the news.
Well, the big news this week is that the Bureau of Land Management finally has a confirmed director. Unfortunately, it's Steve Pearce. We have talked about Pearce a whole lot on the pod. In case you've missed it, the very short version is that Pearce thinks there is too much public land. Now he's in charge of it. Back when he was a member of Congress representing New Mexico, Pearce supported bills that would have privatized public land. It would have undermined the Antiquities Act. He even asked President Trump to remove protections from Organ Mountain's Desert Peaks National Monument, which was in his district. The Senate voted on his nomination on Monday as part of a package of 49 nominees in total, which allowed the Senate Stewardship Caucus to basically dodge blame for putting a public lands opponent in charge of our public lands.
In other news, members of the House Natural Resources Committee absolutely owned Doug Burgum in a hearing last week in which Burgum tried to defend Trump's indefensible 2027 budget proposal for the Interior Department. Aaron, what were your favorite moments out of this train wreck of a hearing?
Number one was just members of Congress finally calling BS on Burgum's line that if the wind's not blowing, sun's not shining, then renewables are useless. I mean, you had members of Congress right off the top. You had Jared Huffman, the ranking member, introducing the concept of a battery into the congressional record. Seth Magaziner actually pulled a battery out during his Q&A, just noting how much nonsense it is, Doug Burgum's line about renewables. Everyone knows it's nonsense, including Doug Burgum, who was a huge fan of wind energy all of his years as governor of North Dakota, which is, of course, a massive wind energy state.
Totally. Yeah, that was pretty special. They really made him look incredibly stupid.
Are you or are you not in North Dakota one of the top 10 or so in the country for renewable energy as a percentage basis, so weighted over a full year?
For rated, but
Yes.
when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, they
Mr.
produces
Secretary,
nothing.
we have these things called batteries. We've had them since Benjamin Franklin. They come in much bigger sizes than this, which makes solar and wind useful not just off-peak, but on-peak as well.
And I really enjoyed the committee's focus on how Burgum is helping Trump spend Park Service money on vanity projects in D.C. while asking for huge budget cuts for the rest of the Park Service. Maxine Dexter of Oregon had a great back and forth with Burgum on that, as did Jared Huffman.
Did you know that 90% of the American public supports our national parks? And 2-to-1, they do not support the investment in the East Wing and the new ballroom. So are you supporting Mr. Trump's vanity projects, or are you supporting the national parks that our people in this country treasure?
This is a false trade-off.
It is not a false trade-off.
It is absolutely
Our
a false
budgets
trade-off.
are values documents, Mr. Secretary. You said this in your opening comments, that your priorities and your values are where you're spending money, and you are refusing to stand up to our president who is investing in vanity projects instead of our federal lands and our national parks.
They both brought visuals, giant posters, which I really, it's
Including
always fun
Trump's
in a
own
hearing.
tweets, of course.
Yes, including Trump's own tweets about the triumphal arch, I think. And
the pool, the AI
And
slop.
the pool, the AI slop, yes, the pool. If you haven't seen that photo, it's really bizarre. Burgum and Trump and some other folks are all bathing in the reflecting pool, swimming in it, really, relaxing in it. Speaking of the reflecting pool, Joe Neguse asked Burgum why he issued a no-bid contract of $13 million to restore the Lincoln reflecting pool, or actually to paint it blue. It really is what they're doing. Yeah. And Burgum just pretended he didn't know what Neguse was talking about. So that was pretty special.
And then there's the arch, of course, where Burgum claimed he couldn't talk about the arch in any meaningful way because there were no plans for the arch. And literally the next morning, Jared Huffman goes out to the side of the arch where there are construction crews already digging.
So can you just confirm with this arch specifically, who is this arch for? Who's it being built for?
I think you're probably aware that there's been no final agency action around building something on a site.
That was not my question about
No, but
technicality on final agency action. Who's it being built for?
It's not a technicality. You're acting.
This is my question, Mr. Secretary. I'm sorry, that's the way it works. Who is the arch being built for?
The frame of your question is that there has been a approved proposal and something is actually being built.
It's really notable because that exchange, in hindsight, with the construction actually happening, that starts to look a lot like lying to Congress.
Yeah.
And potential perjury. You're not just dissembling. Like, clearly, he knows there's work happening there. So to say I don't have anything to talk about because there's no plan, no. There's clearly a plan. They're already doing the work.
Right. He said he claimed it was just a discussion, not even a proposal, and yet they're currently building it. We actually saw a headline this morning that it looks like Trump is going to go ahead and try to use some obscure authority to push through the arch
from the 19th century.
Without going through Congress and getting permission to build that. So they are building it, and it sounds like they're just going to keep building it.
Yeah. There was another fabulous exchange with Congressman Dave Min, who called out Burgum on China, noting that America is way behind in terms of putting new energy online, despite President Trump's claim that we're in an energy emergency. Like, China's bringing the renewables and storage online, and America is not.
Right.
And obviously that ties into affordability. Gas prices, I saw some folks paying $5 a gallon here in Colorado, where gas has tended to be cheap. Like this notion that we are somehow energy dominant, when Burgum himself is continuing to block these renewable energy projects that would, in fact, bring down electricity prices in the middle of this bizarre Iran situation. It was not a good hearing. And then we had the border wall, of course, and what happened at Cabeza Prieta.
Right, yeah. Adelita Grijalva, who is, of course, Raul Grijalva's daughter, who's now a congresswoman from Arizona. She replaced her father in his seat, and she took Burgum to task for allowing the contractors working on the border wall to bulldoze an ancient geoglyph inside of Cabeza Prieta Wildlife Refuge. Burgum, he kind of had to own it. There's pictures of it. So he said sorry, but then he proceeded to argue over just how much of the geoglyph was bulldozed, which really just wasn't a good look.
It's a bad look. There was lots of embarrassing moments, but that one was just downright offensive to try and say, well, maybe it wasn't that bad, and to quibble over that. The whole thing, top to bottom, so bad that John Oliver took notice during his show. And I think just as a rule of thumb, if your congressional hearing is entertaining enough for John Oliver, you've had a very bad week in front of Congress. The whole darn thing is like 4.5 hours long. I don't know that you should go watch all of it, but certainly watching some of these highlights, Doug Burgum is not enjoying this job and can't defend what he is doing.
For sure. And we've actually clipped a lot of those most embarrassing moments and put them on a new social media account we're running called Burgum Blunders. That's on Instagram. If you want to see the sort of highlights, go check them out.
Lowlights, perhaps.
Lowlights. Right. Sure.
Go listen to an interview.
Depends on whose side you're on. Evan Simon is a reporter for Floodlight, an investigative news outlet focused on climate stories. He recently looked into a land swap in Montana's Crazy Mountains that essentially locks the public out of thousands of acres of prime hunting habitat that used to be public land. Evan, thanks for your great reporting and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
So your recent story covered a really troubling land swap by the U.S. Forest Service that essentially cuts off public access to a lot of the Crazy Mountains in Montana. What kind of terrain did the public give up, and what did they get? What did we get in return?
Right, so it's important to understand that the swap involved public lands in two separate areas. There was the Crazy Mountains, and then some also Forest Service land outside of Big Sky. And while there were some who were upset about what happened in Big Sky, the controversy mostly erupted around what happened in the Crazies. And what critics argue is that the public gave up mostly lower elevation areas surrounding the Crazies in exchange for higher elevation areas. And these lower elevation areas were more accessible, rich in wildlife and timber. And in exchange, essentially, the public, a lot of the folks I talked to said that they got a land of rock and ice that only the most skilled mountaineers will be able to consistently reach. And so essentially, a lot of the folks that I talked to were saying that private interests got the hills and valleys and the public got the tops of the mountains. And what's also important to just point out, if it's okay, is that it's not just the land that was lost, but also the access to it, as well as sort of what the makeup of the Crazies is today and who it might benefit. And a lot of folks were really concerned about the large private property owners in the area now having much more exclusive access to the range. And a lot of these large landowners, they operate high-end hunting operations on their properties where you can pay thousands of dollars to go on these guided hunting operations. And they now have a lot more exclusive access to the range and the natural resources that the public is used to enjoying.
And I feel like there's maybe a little explanation here that the checkerboard is in play here. Folks who are familiar with public land access issues across the West know what that is, but give us just a quick explanation of how that comes into play. This is a remnant of the railroad days.
Yeah, this is really important to understand, and I'm sure many of your listeners are well aware of what's been called Lincoln's chessboard, but just to be sure, so the patchwork or checkerboard pattern of public and private lands in the Crazies is a direct result of the railroads, essentially, and the decisions made by the U.S. government in the 1800s. Essentially, the government issued land in the range and across much of the West to railroad companies as payment for building the Transcontinental Railroad. But they were concerned about the railroads having too much power in the West as a result of this. So what they decided to do was to issue that land on an every other square mile basis. And that resulted in this checkerboard pattern where you have green spaces that represented public lands and white spaces that represented private lands. And that resulted in this checkerboard pattern that really established lines of contention that persist to this day. Because when the government gave the land to the railroads, it did so with conditions, namely that any public road or trail that was in place at the time of the transfer was still supposed to be open to the public. And over time, some of the wealthiest people in the state essentially started buying up these private parcels in the Crazies, and they didn't take so kindly to the public crossing through their land. And so they set up no trespassing signs or even blocked trails. Things got really heated. Hikers were arrested. A ranger was reassigned because of him trying to defend public access in the range. It got pretty intense. So the checkerboard is a genuine problem, and I think that's really important to recognize, not just for the Forest Service, but for people that were living out there. And solving it is really, the only way you can really solve the checkerboard is through a land swap. But I think what's really important to remember is that how you solve that problem is key. The details, are really important here. And the outcome really upset a lot of Montanans that I spoke to.
Yeah, not all swaps are created equal. Not all public land is created equal. Right. So you've sort of intimated at this, and I think it's time we go there. The company that owns the Yellowstone Club, Cross Harbor Capital, was behind this swap. Can you tell our listeners about the Yellowstone Club in case they're not familiar with it, and say a little bit more about this Cross Harbor Capital Partners outfit and maybe the connection between the Big Sky swap and the Crazies?
Yeah, I mean, the Yellowstone Club is basically a 7,000-foot high mountaintop retreat for the mega rich. It's located outside of Big Sky, and it's one of the most exclusive places on the planet. A membership requires owning a multi-million-dollar home in the area. You have to pay initiation fees in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in exchange, members get access to what's advertised as the only private ski resort in the world. It has its own concert venue, its own fire department, its own celebrity chef restaurant. It's also a really secretive place. It has heavily controlled entrance gates, and Google Street View doesn't show its streets. They, of course, don't disclose who their members are, but reporters like myself, as well as folks at Forbes and New York Magazine, have used property records and public statements to show that a lot of household names are a member of this club. We're thinking of people like Mark Zuckerberg, Tom Brady, Paris Hilton, Justin Timberlake, the Gates family, Warren Buffett, Bill Ackman. It's essentially the highest concentration of billionaires anywhere outside of Manhattan. And so it's a conglomeration of some of the wealthiest and most powerful people on the planet.
And so how are they connected to the Crazy Mountains? How did they get involved in this?
Yeah, so for years, the club had wanted to acquire Forest Service lands in Big Sky that were adjacent to their club so that they could have an expert ski run. But the Forest Service officials didn't take them up on the idea until the club offered to help resolve these access disputes that we had discussed that had been occurring in the Crazies for decades. So the club's desire for land in Big Sky became directly tied to the Crazies, which are about 100 miles away from Big Sky, so they're not really all that close. And I did ask the former forest supervisor at the time why the Forest Service turned to the Yellowstone Club to be a partner in solving these issues in the Crazies. It's this controversial billionaires club. Why did you go to them? And what she essentially told me was that the Forest Service didn't have the resources to handle it, and the club did. Now that's sort of the official story, but there is some important context to be aware of here as well, which is that at least one Yellowstone Club member owns a tremendous amount of land in the Crazies. He's actually among the largest landowners inside the Forest Service boundary. And critics say that as a result of this land swap, that Yellowstone Club member now enjoys nearly exclusive access to the range. And he is also one of these people that runs a high-end hunting operation from his properties.
Oh, wow.
And I would imagine, it seems like there's a lot of the issues that are playing out across Montana and to an extent Wyoming and Idaho, all condensed into one really concise example where you've got these billionaires coming in and really fundamentally changing the way of life for folks who have lived in these places for a much longer time. This is, to an extent, it is the Yellowstone effect of the Kevin Costner show and what everything else, the pandemic playing out. How is this playing among the folks who've been in Montana for years?
Yeah, I talked with one fifth-generation Montanan, Brad Wilson. He grew up in the Crazies as a young boy, helping his grandfather on a sheep ranch up there, and has lived there most of his life ever since then, and lives there today in the very small town of Wilsall, which is about population 200. And it's really kind of that kind of side of the Crazies, especially the western side, has the vibe of a lot of what I think Montana resembled, even 50 years ago. It's these small agricultural communities with these just breathtaking mountains surrounding them. And the way of life that has been changing there is just so drastic due to massive influx of wealth in the area. Before this land swap even came into play, there's just been an influx of wealthy private landowners buying up ranches in that area. And that's already, just changed a lot of people's lives, changed the economy. It's becoming more of a service industry as opposed to an agricultural industry. And that's changing a lot of lifestyles around there. And, Brad always talked about basically Montana becoming a playground for the rich and famous now, and that it was increasingly difficult for people like him to afford to live there in the first place, but also now to enjoy the mountains that they grew up enjoying their whole lives, and their grandparents did as well. So
I want to kind of go back to the basics here. This is just not a good swap for the public, yet the Forest Service administrator who you talked to thought it was, and she sort of said, this was our only choice. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about why the Forest Service allowed this to happen and why the swap turned out so poorly. Like, why couldn't it have been half of the good stuff and half of the bad stuff? Like, the billionaires got exactly what they wanted, and the public kind of got screwed. And it seems like the Forest Service really is responsible ultimately for that at the end of the day. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I'm sure that the Forest Service would refute a lot of that, and what they really focus on is that this swap resolves these access disputes that have been happening in the Crazies for decades in a permanent way, essentially, and that is worth a lot. And there's I can understand a lot of that in some ways. Navigating the checkerboard, for a lot of folks is a really extremely difficult process that leads to corner crossing, which is this whole other legal debate that's going on in the state right now. It's not an easy thing to navigate the checkerboard. And so solving that is a key, I think, goal for any, it's a mandate for the Forest Service to try to seek out ways to solve that problem. It's just about how they went about solving that really upset a lot of local people in the area. And with the Yellowstone Club's involvement in the process being, largely kept secret for many years, I think that also made people really distrustful of what would happen. And then there was, of course, the Yellowstone Club purchasing a very large ranch in the vicinity of the Crazies in the midst of all this that just kind of changed a lot of folks' perspectives on it. I think from a lot of people that I talked to, whether it was at local hunting groups or conservation groups, were open to the concept of a land swap to begin with, because they recognized this problem and it needing to be solved. They just don't appreciate the way it got solved. But, other proponents of the deal, just to finish out what they might, say in this situation is, in addition to, solving this checkerboard problem, which it doesn't solve entirely, by the way. It really, what it does effectively, if you look at the map, is it essentially creates a ring of private land, nearly complete ring of private land around the East Crazies that has now surrounded a chunk of public land with very little access. So this again gets to the issue of how people feel that it's reduced access in the range, also because of its impacts on the trail network in the Crazies, where it's reduced trail access to a single point of entry along a 40-mile range, and now there's one trailhead to access that entire range. They also say, though, that trail is going to connect to the west side and create this 40-mile loop. So they say that is a way that it's increasing public access. So there's really a lot of different views around this. The people that I encountered that were most for the exchange were obviously the Forest Service, representatives of the Yellowstone Club, but on the other side of it were basically every other major conservation group in the state, as well as all of these local hunter and residents in the area that were really opposed to this. So, and then the last thing I would say is that despite there being very differing views on how the exchange ended up, the Forest Service saying this is great and the public really having a lot of mixed views around it, the public comments are pretty clear about this situation. And that's one thing that was pretty interesting to me, was that we analyzed more than 1,000 public comments that came in for this land swap, and the vast majority were opposed. More than 2/3 were opposed to the land swap, and yet the Forest Service went through with it anyway. And I think that's always a hard thing when when I'm a journalist looking at an issue, trying to understand why something gets done, trying to understand exactly what overrode public opinion has been difficult to decipher.
Quick clarifying question. You mentioned this, but I want to make sure it's really clear. The Yellowstone Club bought a ranch in the Crazy Mountains that is essentially inside of this loop of land that they now control. Is that correct? How does that all work together?
So it's not inside what's called the Forest Service boundary, where it's sort of the national public lands start in the Crazies. It's just outside of that. But essentially in 2021, the owners of the Yellowstone Club purchased the Crazy Mountain Ranch, which is this 18,000-acre private ranch that abuts the southern end of the Crazies. And what it really shocked a lot of people that I talked to, because part of the pitch, like I said, for many years, people had no idea that the Yellowstone Club was involved in orchestrating this land swap. They hired private consultants who referred to unnamed clients. And when it did eventually come out that the Yellowstone Club was the client in that situation, they quickly worked to reassure all these local stakeholders, look, we are not interested in the Crazy Mountains. What we are interested in is getting the land in Big Sky, and this is how we're going to do that. We are not going to develop the Crazy Mountains. And so when they purchased this 18,000-acre private ranch abutting the Crazy Mountains, that really felt like to one person I talked to in the conservation community, just a bait and switch, essentially, where they were saying, we have no interest in the Crazy Mountains, yet here we are buying a 18,000-acre private ranch that they are now developing into a private membership-only experience centered around a new golf course that is drawing a lot of controversy in the area, as well as a luxury spa. And so this just has contributed to the general fear in the Crazies that it will someday more resemble communities like Big Sky than it will communities like Wilsall.
At the risk of bringing up a corporate org chart on a mostly audio-only podcast, there are a lot of companies and shell companies in play here, and it does feel like that is germane to all of this, because you've got Yellowstone Club and Crazy Mountain Ranch. They're on the Discovery Land Company's website. Discovery Land Company is owned eventually up to a company called Cross Harbor. And last year we talked to Ryan Bussey, he's actually running for Congress right now. There's a development on Flathead Lake, and that's now called Territory 1889, that Discovery bought up a whole bunch of land, including a historic orchard. Discovery's also got properties off Arizona, Nevada, Idaho. How are all of these companies connected, and is the obfuscation part of the plan as far as you can tell?
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely get a bit confusing for sure. So the Yellowstone Club is owned by Cross Harbor Capital, which is this private equity firm based out of Boston. but its development and operations are managed by Lone Mountain Land Company, which is a subsidiary of Cross Harbor, but also done in partnership with Discovery Land Company, which is a luxury real estate company with properties and private communities around the world. And so, yes, Cross Harbor, via Lone Mountain Land Company, has created essentially one of the largest luxury resort footprints in the Rocky Mountains. In addition to the Yellowstone Club, they also own a number of other luxury resort private communities in Big Sky alone. There's 17,000-acre Moonlight Basin, 6,000-acre Spanish Peaks Club, and then, as previously mentioned, the 18,000-acre Crazy Mountain Ranch, to name a few. Discovery Land Company, meanwhile, has projects in Flathead Lake, like you mentioned, but also in Whitefish, in Lake Tahoe, Texas, California, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, and that's just the Western U.S. They also have communities across the East Coast, as well as the Caribbean, Europe, and even the UAE. And that whole model, really for both of these, less so, Lone Mountain has a slightly diversified portfolio, but Discovery's portfolio is entirely, private luxury communities that are, these really insane kind of places, and they're spread out across the world.
Wow. Just out of curiosity, I know you were looking into this specific land swap. Are there other problematic land swaps that Cross Harbor or Lone Mountain have been a part of in the state that you know about?
I think that, not that I'm aware of right now. I mean, there's a lot of concern around, I think in the report, one of the other things we got into is that, amongst these sort of celebrities and tech titans and, business tycoons that are members here at the Yellowstone Club, they also include top members of the Trump administration, namely the man in charge of most of the national public lands, which is Doug Burgum, the Secretary of Interior, has been a member of the club for years and has a multi-million-dollar condo there. And he has been putting out this concept. He has partnered with HUD to try to create what he says is affordable housing across America's public lands, to basically use public lands for housing development. And that's where things that some of the ethics experts I spoke to were starting to get really concerned, essentially, because there's a lot of housing experts and public lands experts that have drawn some questions around how feasible it is for affordable housing to be placed in public lands. I mean, a lot of them are very remote, inaccessible places, and even I believe there was a homeless coalition that came out against the idea recently. And what people do expect to happen, a lot of these folks, is the people that are interested in those public lands and developing them for housing are luxury resort developers that are actually, their whole business model is built around having a remote, inaccessible location that the world's elites can flock to. And so that's where having a Yellowstone Club member be shepherding this initiative that is designed to create housing across the nation's public lands seems like it could be potentially a conflict of interest, and had alarmed some ethics experts I had talked to. But it is a potential right now. To my knowledge, it has not happened, but in the ethics expert I talked to said that basically Doug Burgum should have nothing to do with that program while he owns this stake in the Yellowstone Club.
A lot of these surrounding lands, obviously we're talking about Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, not under Doug Burgum, obviously, but the Forest Service and BLM and the Park Service all work closely together. We've seen Burgum and Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins holding events side by side, press conferences about grazing rules, things like that. You don't have to go too far afield to also end up on BLM land surrounding a bunch of these properties. Is there any indication, have you seen indications that Discovery or any of these various related companies are also interested in BLM land or grazing permits, anything like that?
I haven't seen it expressly stated as much, but I think it's hard to ignore just the long history that the Yellowstone Club in particular has in acquiring public lands. I mean, the club is built atop what were once public lands, and then it also got involved in this recent land swap. And so clearly these developers have interests in public lands, and I don't see that going away. I think that is increasing currently. Whether or not it's going to end up in a annual report or a press release is another matter.
And I suppose in terms of potential conflicts, once you end up in a situation where you've got grazing permits also in play, then it is 100% a conflict for Doug Burgum to be anywhere near that, being that he owns, how much is that condo worth? $22 million, something like that?
Yeah, it's a $22 million condo that he owns, according to the most recent appraisal that we could find. And he also owns $250,000, I should say up to $250,000 in the club itself, according to his financial disclosure forms. And to our knowledge, he has not divested from any of those assets upon taking office.
Well, seems like he should do that.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask,
Yeah.
what was the reporting process like for this project? I mean, it seems like you were out there a long time. There's a 22-minute accompanying documentary that's up on YouTube with this piece. Talk us through that process and what you learned just spending that much time in this area.
Yeah, I first started hearing about the land swap when it was in the works. I follow Montana's always been a very special place to me. I grew up visiting it a lot because I have an uncle in Wyoming who I would spend most summers with, and then I did a lot of reporting in Montana around missing and murdered Indigenous women earlier in my career, and so I've always sort of kept in touch with Montana reporters and local outlets, and had followed the Crazy Mountains land swap as it was going on. But once I started looking at basically financial disclosure forms and realized that Doug Burgum was a member of this club, it felt like, okay, this is a story that's bigger than Montana. And then I started to read more about the growing privatization and influence of wealthy folks on public lands across the West. And it felt like it was really important to sort of really tune in. And so I was, fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with local hunters in the area that took me into the mountains and brought me up to one of their hunting camps that they're worried about losing as a result of all of this, as well as trying to speak to some of the key players involved with the swap, both folks like Eric Nyland, who is a staffer for former Senator John Tester and hadn't really talked about this issue that much publicly before, and that really helped me get a front row seat to understanding the inner workings of the land swap. I reached out to so many people that didn't want to talk about this. I think that's another thing that I really noticed in sort of, which happens a lot in our work, but it was pretty noticeable this time. I mean, very few people wanted to talk about the situation. Few people wanted to defend the land swap other than the Forest Service and the Yellowstone Club. I'm always looking for that, and it was difficult to find. And so, it was a really, a really enjoyable reporting process in a lot of ways, despite the subject matter. I mean, I'll always be thrilled to go into the mountains with sources and try to understand what's happening to them.
So one more question I
go
thought
ahead.
of while you were talking. Were Montana's delegation really involved in this at all? I feel like I remember someone mentioning that Senator Daines was kind of pushing this land swap.
So there's no direct tie between Senator Daines and the land swap itself, but there's a lot of ties between Senator Daines and what's happening in the crazies in general, as well as Senator Daines and the Yellowstone Club. So, it's hard to decipher exactly, what role he played, if any, in the land swap itself. However, he was instrumental in getting this ranger reassigned back when I was talking earlier. Essentially, his involvement stems from, while the access disputes were happening on the crazies, there was a U.S. District Forest Service ranger who was going out and doing things like removing no trespassing signs, taking pictures of them, and also advising people not to sign in to these sort of placards that have been put out by the private landowners. Because, not to get too legalese with you all, but once you start doing that, you create what's called permissive use. And it essentially can become a legal tactic to try to cut off public access to a trail if private landowners successfully get people to consistently sign into them. So the Forest Service ranger was telling his colleagues, do not sign into these trails. It can be a way that the Forest Service and therefore the public lose rights over these trails. Do not do that. Wow. That infuriated a lot of these large landowners along with his actions on the trails. And so what they did was they wrote an open letter to Secretary Daines, as well as then Trump Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, so the man in charge of the Forest Service, and as well as one of Montana's most powerful politicians, who then wrote to the Forest Service about this ranger, who was subsequently investigated and reassigned, ultimately reinstated after finding no wrongdoing that he occurred. But in the meantime, I talked to people that said that this basically just sent a huge chilling effect throughout the Forest Service, that if you were seen as defending public access to contested trails, you could get some of the most powerful people in the country on your back and be reassigned and investigated as a result. So that's really where Daines' role is focused around. However, it is important to note he's spent a lot of time at the Yellowstone Club, according to public statements and Instagram pictures and things like that. He's, there's been a lot of fundraising that's happened there. Members of Cross Harbor have donated to his campaigns, as well as a lot of the local landowners in this area that were sort of the large landowners that benefited in some ways from the exchange. So he definitely does have a lot of indirect ties to what's happened with the land swap. But as far as him being behind the actual land swap, there's no evidence that I have around that.
Got it. Well, thank you. That's very interesting background.
The land swap essentially, what some folks would say is that the land swap benefited a lot of Dane's allies, whether it be the Yellowstone Club or these local large landowners in the area. Whether or not Danes, did something directly to make that happen is sort of hard to tell.
Well, this is a dynamic I'm sure we are not through seeing in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. There's going to be more here. So really appreciate all of your work here. Evan Simon, reporter with Floodlight, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for your interest.
Well, that is it for today. Go follow that Burgum Blunders Instagram account. We're posting a whole lot more of what Burgum is up to these days because it's not great.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. I'm working on that account, and it's incredible. Every week we just have too much content to post.
No, it's true.
He's really out there embarrassing himself in many ways. You can find links to Evan's story about the Crazy Mountains and his YouTube documentary in the show notes. Go check that out. It's an incredible story.
Thanks again to Evan Simon with Floodlight News for his time, and thank you for listening to The Landscape.